Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our panel on political correctness. I'm Molly Ball, a national political correspondent for Time magazine, and we have a terrific lineup of panelists assembled here. Stephen Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard, author of many best-selling books, including the forthcoming Enlightenment Now, which argues sort of against the grain that things are actually getting better in the world in all kinds of ways. Parvathy Santosh Kumar, who's based in Chicago, the director of network learning for Strive Together USA, which facilitates large-scale social change to advance opportunities in education and social mobility, and is here as part of the Global Shapers program. Lonnie Bunch, the legendary historian and founder of the new Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., which if you've tried to get in, you know is the hottest ticket in D.C., still difficult to get in, but if you do manage to, just an incredible experience. This was a I would say lonely crusade that you waged for many, many years, a dream finally achieved to spectacular effect, and it's also a beautiful building. And So-Young Kang is based in Singapore and is here as a young global leader. She's the founder and CEO of Nobi, which is a mobile learning platform for enterprises focused on mobile micro learning. So a very cool, diverse array of perspectives, which is kind of the point of what we are talking about, right, is how people with diverse perspectives can communicate in this world rather than just tearing each other apart, which is a dynamic I'm very familiar with as a political reporter. So this idea of political correctness, famously, we have had on campuses, particularly in the United States, campus protest speakers being shouted down and uninvited. These have now become sort of buzzwords, microaggressions and trigger warnings, and these are real things. Liberal professors that I know at universities all over the United States actually do sort of live in fear of their students and the micro controversies that can turn into really toxic situations, and then you have provocateurs like Milo Yiannopoulos who have exploited this dynamic to become sort of to deliberately provoke the so-called snowflakes and create these confrontations. And if you watch, for example, Fox News, you would think this is the leading problem facing America, the so-called censorship or the oppression of free speech by liberal academia. And I would argue that this dynamic reached its sort of absurd conclusion in the 2016 election, which actually pitted a social justice warrior, Hillary Clinton, against an internet troll, Donald Trump. So let's get into this. I want to start with, we had a sort of perfect case study just this month that Stephen was involved in, a social media controversy involving something you said on a panel, in fact. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll get one today. So Stephen, can you tell this story in your own words and of how it came to be that you were the subject of a headline on the Nazi Daily Stormer website that said, "Harvard Jew professor admits the alt-right is right about everything."
Right, followed by a New York Times article called "How Social Media is Making Us Stupid." There was a panel at Harvard University, last fall, on the topic, "Did political correctness help elect Trump?" Everyone on the panel argued that it did, and my own argument was that political correctness, by treating certain facts as taboo, helped stoke the alt-right by giving them the sense that there were truths that the academic establishment could not face up to. Therefore, and by alt-right, by the way, I don't mean torch-carrying skinheads. I mean the highly educated, mostly men, often in tech, who find each other on the internet, often highly literate, These are not kind of knuckle dragging brutes of the kind that we saw in Charlottesville. So I just want to be clear of what I mean by the alt-right. I know they exist because I have seen them among students at Harvard University. They tend to stay under the radar because they know that they would be in professional jeopardy. But to people who say that there aren't any intelligent, literate people in the alt-right, I can testify that is false. And what feeds them is the hidden knowledge that certain facts are just taboo in respectable intellectual circles, and that only increases their own sense of aggrievement and of superiority. Moreover, I think it stokes the most pernicious interpretations of a number of these facts, such as gender differences, such as differences between capitalist and communist countries, such as differences in statistics on crime among ethnic groups, where if those beliefs are allowed to fester in isolation, then people who are aware of them can come up with the most, descend to the most toxic interpretations of them, whereas if they are out in the open, then they can be countered by arguments that put them in perspective and that don't allow them to become fodder for some of the toxic beliefs of the alt-right. So the talk that I gave was on how we're inadvertently feeding the alt-right and what we ought to do to try to starve them. And then the remarks when they were put on the on YouTube were then doctored by some of these alt-right sites, so that the parts where I said, well, they've discovered these facts that are truer in the record was not followed by, but then they have this perverse interpretation of them. Then that led to there were some alt-right sites that used this doctored video to rather perversely argue that I was in favor of the alt-right, a movement that I absolutely loathe, and which the point of my remarks being, what can we do to combat it? Then I became the target of internet trolls on the left saying, well, this shows that that Pinker was sympathetic to the alt-right all along, and he's shown his true colors. Fortunately, it was a controversy that was pretty much confined to social media, and a number of excellent articles came out in the Times, in the Guardian, in a number of blogs setting the record straight. So I didn't even have to say anything about it. And I'd much rather be kind of attacked by social media and defended by the mainstream media than the other way around. But it is a sign of how quickly even a kind of a meta discussion of the phenomenon of political correctness can be turned around by some of the political correctness police to further distort and muddy and indeed make debate stupider, as the New York Times put it.
So, but I guess the counter argument to the point that you were making would be, do we really need to be discussing whether the Nazis have a point, or whether the arguments for racism have any legitimacy to them? I mean, in this day and age, ought there not be points of view that are taboo, that don't have a place in discussion? And do we, to some extent, legitimize those points of view when we engage with them? I mean, Lonnie, maybe I'll open this up to you, because so much of your work is about presenting perspectives and points of view and history that perhaps the dominant culture would prefer not to engage with. So what do you think about this question?
Well, I mean, I think that if you look at this notion of political correctness, it's an interesting evolution, right? It evolved from a way for people who were anonymous and voiceless to demand a freer and fairer country. And it's evolved into this weapon that allowed people to sort of tamp down the debates and discussions that are essential for a democracy. My notion is, as reprehensible as the Ku Klux Klan is to me, I really feel strongly that we've got to find the space to allow those conversations to happen. Because I look back in the 1960s, there were few opportunities for African Americans to raise the issues that were at the core of who they were. Suddenly you're allowed to have Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali on campuses at the time when many of the university hierarchy said that's not the direction we want to go. So I worry about saying there are certain things that are taboo. However, I feel strongly that debate and protest are at the heart of what we should be doing. So when in the National Museum of African American History, for example, some from the alt-right left nooses to sort of talk about, to suggest that what we were doing was politically correct. And my notion was, let us take those nooses, let us write about it in the op-eds, let us use them in the museum, and use them as points to basically argue that we need to understand our enemies, but we need to be able to contextualize it. And that's what I really try to do with my work.
Well, and Stephen, as you mentioned, so much of this does take place on social media, on the internet, where, as you said, Lonnie, the empowering or the giving of a platform to so many people who previously might have been kept out by the gatekeepers of institutions is disturbing to people perhaps in power. So Young, I'd like to hear your international perspective on this issue for one thing, but also as someone who works in social media and technology, whether you think that those are a force for good or evil in this regard.
No, I think it's what's been really interesting, I think, especially with technology, social media, this whole topic of political correctness. So I'm actually American. So I'm Korean American from East Brooklyn, New York. And I moved to Singapore 7 years ago. And, I think and now living in Singapore for 7 years, what I'm realizing is I don't think I had as much freedom of speech as I thought I did in the US because of political correctness, because there are so many important topics that need to be discussed and debated but are shut down and hushed because they are sensitive. And so what I realized, actually, even in terms of religious freedom, I find more religious freedom in Singapore, oddly enough, than I do in the US. Because you have mosques, churches, and temples all sit, literally next to each other on the same street, and people are very free to talk about those things. So when you talk about social media, I think part of the challenge we have is that technology has unintentionally dehumanized people, and so what ends up happening is that your soundbite then equals you, the person, the character. Now, if I have a relationship with Lonnie and we get to know each other and then we have a debate, I'm not going to hate his guts because he's a different point of view than me, because I know his person and I think he's a good person and I'll know the whole person versus just that sound bite totally taken out of context. So I think part of the challenge with social media and with Twitter and sound bites is that you don't have the person. It's not a human being that you're talking to. You're debating about a certain point or something taken in one context, and then you actually make judgments. So my big, I guess, worry is around how people are equating a point of view with the person. And technology is actually fostering that. So I wonder if there's an opportunity to start to, to rethink how we engage with humans and understand that your point of view does not equal all of you. And I can disagree with you, and it's okay. I can respectfully disagree and still like you as a human being, where it's so difficult to do that today. Even when you know people. There's so many friendships that have been broken up because of different political views. 20 years of friendship, 30 years, that's absolutely ridiculous. Your views don't form who you are. And so I think with social media, it actually just compounds that. So then you have that kind of continuing, and then it's overnight, right? Then you're a character. You've gone from, a liberal-minded person to an alt-right supporter because of one comment. And I mean, obviously you're not, right? So it's just the craziness of, I think, all of that.
And so, Parv, I want to ask you sort of the opposite question. As someone who works on the ground with vulnerable populations, is this a debate that's I think this often can feel to me like it's not a real problem, right? Or it's sort of a first world problem. And for people who are actually struggling with poverty and inequality, does this debate have any impact, or is it somewhat divorced from their reality?
Yeah, it's a really important question because this often to me feels like its own form of work avoidance, where people, instead of actually addressing the root causes of inequities that exist in our country and actually talking about things like systemic oppression or institutional racism, are talking about the words and the language we use instead of actually talking about the real issues. And so if we can instead get people to get past the debate about language and have conflict at the language level or at the personal conflict level and move to a place where we can actually identify what's the shared result we actually want to achieve for our world and how can we actually work beyond our differences and work across lines of difference to get there. And that's the work that I do at Strive Together, a national organization where we're working in communities to help people across different sectors come together around common goals for ensuring that every kid has a path to economic mobility. And so instead of arguing about whether people of different sides of the political spectrum have different perspectives about whether every child can succeed, we kind of help people work through that. And whether from places that are urban, like progressive Portland, where people are talking about race and inequity very openly, to places where, like rural Racine, where it's not as talked about, we're coaching leaders through the process of actually working through having productive dialogue about this in a way that gets to action and results for kids and families on the ground, as opposed to having a theoretical debate about what this is about.